Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Garage with Bonesaw. Today we'll be taking a look at the Tier 8 Premium Japanese Medium Tank, the STA-2. Now, the STA-2 is a tank that I think has an undeservedly bad reputation, and I think part of that comes with the circumstances in which it was introduced into the game. The STA-2 came into World of Tanks in the same patch as the French AMX Chasseur de Char, the CDC, and the CDC is a really good tank, and the STA-2, while not bad, I think was a little bit overshadowed by the CDC and the patch when they were both released. And I think personally that the STA-2 I think was maybe a little bit underpowered when it was released because it wasn't really tested as much on the test server. I think everyone was trying to play the CDC and no one really touched the STA-2 very much. So it received a couple of buffs after it first came out. And I was originally just going to talk about this tank kind of in the state it is now in light of those buffs. However, Wargaming have just announced that in patch 9.15, the STA-2 is getting, I wouldn't say reworked, but it's getting buffed, I guess you could say. The gun's being changed as to how it works in terms of penetration, accuracy, and reload time, and I think that'll really change how the STA-2 actually plays in game. So instead I'm going to do this one as a two-parter. This will be part 1 as it plays in 9.14, and then after 9.15 comes out, I'll do the part 2 comparing how it's changed, if the changes have negatively or positively affected the tank, etc., etc. So, what is the STA-2? Well, the STA-2 and its cousin, the STA-1, are the prototypes for the Type 61, which is Japan's first post-war main battle tank. As you can see, they're quite different from things like the Chinukai and the Chihe, which are kind of Japanese wartime tanks, which have the distinctive Hara suspension, the very angular structure, whereas the STA-2, much more cast armor, and it looks a lot more like kind of the post-war American tanks, the M46, M47, M48. So the STA-2 is interesting because there's not a huge amount of information out there on it in English, at least. And while I do speak a little bit of Japanese, I don't speak enough to really kind of read the Japanese sources. So from what I've been able to gather, in 1945, Japan surrenders. The Imperial Japanese Army and Imperial Japanese Navy are disbanded, and the Imperial Japanese munitions production system is essentially dismantled. And defense of the Japanese home islands is taken over by the American occupation force. And that's all fine until 1950, when the Korean War breaks out. Now, with the outbreak of the Korean War, the American troops are moved to fight in Korea, which means that Japan is essentially left defenseless. So a national police force is raised instead. It's called a police force, but it's more of a militia force. And they were equipped with kind of light infantry weapons, things like rifles, machine guns and stuff, and some amount of tanks, primarily M4 Shermans and M24 Chaffies. But they weren't really a formal army as such. Their main purpose was to kind of protect Japan against the possibility of a communist insurgency, which might happen because there were fears that if communism had spread to Korea, then it might have reached Japan as well. And there were fears of communist insurgency, which kind of replaced the fears of a nationalist resurgence in Japan. That's why Japan was disarmed in the first place. There was fears that Japanese nationalists and imperialists would try and kind of rebuild the nationalist imperial system that existed and had essentially caused Japan's expansion to the Pacific. So by 1953, the Korean War is over, and it was realized that Japan really needed a formal standing defense force of some type. And from this, the Jietai was created, the Rikujo Jietai, the Japan Ground Self-Defense Forces. And by about 1955, they decided that they needed their own domestically produced main battle tank. And there was a very good reason for this. As I mentioned earlier, they were equipped previously with American surplus M4 Shermans and M24 Chaffies. Now, experience in the Korean War had proved that these tanks were more or less obsolete. They couldn't really compete with the newest of the Soviet bloc designs. Additionally, of the two tanks, the Japanese didn't really like the M4 Sherman, because if we have a look in the background, you can see the M4 Sherman over there. It's quite a large tank compared to the M24 Chaffee. Now, your average Japanese tanker at the time was a good deal smaller than your average Western tanker, and it meant that the Japanese had trouble comfortably operating the M4 Sherman. Drivers complained that they weren't able to reach the controls effectively, and it was difficult for the crews to get into the tank via the turret. So it was decided to create a domestically produced tank in light of the needs of Japanese tankers and also the needs of the Japanese nation in terms of defending its unique terrain. So in 1955, the project was started, and two designs evolved from this by about 1957. They were the STA-1 and the STA-2. Now, there were four designs in total: STA-1, 2, 3, and 4. 1 and 2 were produced simultaneously. They then evolved into number 3, which then evolved into number 4. And then number 4 finally became the production model of Type 61 in 1961. So the STA-2 and the STA-1 were essentially competing designs, and they were built with certain limitations in mind, or rather certain parameters. So for instance, a survey was taken of the Japanese army to kind of determine what proportions were required for Japanese tankers. So certain guidelines were set out for how things like how big hatches needed to be, how tall the tank could be in terms of being able to climb into the vehicle, things like the distance of driver control, so how far the clutch pedal had to be from the driving seat, things like that, in order for the crewman to operate the vehicle. Additionally, it was decided that a 90mm gun was the largest gun that could be fitted to the vehicle, because first of all, it was decided that a 90mm round was the largest that a Japanese tanker could adequately handle, and additionally it was felt that with Japan's mountainous terrain, long-range combat wouldn't really be occurring very often, and that a 105mm gun wasn't justified, that a 90mm would be sufficient for those sort of combat conditions. Additionally, height requirements for the tank were stipulated as a result of Japan's rail network. It was felt that a tank for the defense of the Japanese home islands had to be deployable anywhere on the Japanese home islands, and that meant that making use of Japan's rail network was the most efficient way to use the tank. So it was decided that the tank had to be a certain height in order to fit through Japan's railway tunnels. This applied to width as well. Additionally, the tank was originally supposed to only weigh 25 tons. This was so that it could make use of Japan's bridge network. However, at 25 tons, they found they couldn't really put enough armor on it to give it the basic protection against light weaponry, things like autocannons and small arms. So the weight was increased to 30 and then later 35 tons in order to kind of bring it back up to spec in terms of defense against light weapons. At this point in time, it was felt that shaped charge ammunition, so hollow charge weapons, heat rounds, made armor kind of less important. So the Japanese weren't really focusing on armor so much as the ability to use the tank across Japan. And so 35 tons was felt to be acceptable to use the majority of bridges in Japan. So the two tanks were tested, STA-1 and STA-2, and STA-2 was determined to be the better design, because it was found that the STA-2 design had better mobility in wet and muddy conditions, which typically prevail in rice paddies, which are numerous across Japan. And additionally, the STA-1 was also slightly more of an awkward design. It was actually longer. It had an extra road wheel, 7 road wheels instead of 6, and it had a raised engine deck, which you can see on the STA-1 model in-game. And that's one of the things that kind of confuses me about the two tanks in the game as they stand, because the STA-2 was the tank that became the Type 61, with extensive modification, of course, but it's still the tank that kind of formed the base design. Yet it's the premium tank, and the STA-1 gets access to the STA-3's turret, but it never developed into the STA-3, so it's one of those weird choices in World of Tanks, and there's probably a reason for it, but I don't know it. So how does the tank kind of play in World of Tanks then? Well, the STA-2 is an interesting vehicle. In many ways, to me at least, I feel it's exactly what a medium should be, in that it relies on mobility and positioning in order to get the best out of its firepower. Typically in World of Tanks, medium tanks tend to fall into one of two categories. They're either snipers or they're brawlers. So you have tanks like the Panther. The Panther is a long-range sniping tank. Its gun is very accurate, has very high penetration, and while the tank isn't amazing at close combat, generally that gun allows it to engage enemies from a distance, which kind of negates its maneuverability disadvantages. Then on the other hand, you have tanks like the T-44. The T-44 has, generally speaking, pretty good armor, and it's quite mobile. At range, it's not that great, but once you get it up close, it's generally pretty strong, and you generally use its high mobility to kind of outflank the opponent, attack them from their blind side, and use the armor to negate any close range firepower. The STA-2 is kind of awkward in that it doesn't really fit into either of these categories. Its gun isn't accurate enough for long-range work, but equally it doesn't have the armor for close-range work. So it kind of fits into this weird mid-range niche category of kind of the flanking medium tank. Its job is to kind of work on the flanks, find a good position, and use its gun at mid-range before repositioning to a better position to kind of use the gun again with its high rate of fire and adequate penetration. It's not high penetration, but it's adequate. So let's take a look through the tank from the top down. So to start off, we have 1,420 hit points, which is okay for the tier. It's not amazing, however, and generally speaking, you do have to be kind of conservative with your hit points. This tank doesn't really have any armor, so any hits you take will generally take off hit points, so you need to kind of reduce the amount of hits you're taking as much as possible, which, considering that this tank is actually quite small for a medium tank and has some pretty good gun depression, isn't actually too hard so long as you're careful with the vehicle. Additionally, in terms of weight, it only weighs about 34.3 tons compared to its 37 ton weight limit, so you have plenty of room for equipment. Additionally, with 500 horsepower engine, you generally have pretty good mobility. You will get up to your top speed of 45 kilometers per hour pretty quickly. However, it's not as fast as, say, the T-44, the Panzer 58 Mutz, things like that. It's not really a high mobility medium in terms of outflanking your opponents and circling them. It has a pretty good traverse speed of 44 degrees per second, so it is reasonably mobile, and they did buff its terrain crossing capabilities. I think it was a patch after the tank was released, so it's actually pretty good at moving across soft ground. In particular, it seems to be really good crossing rivers, but it's not great at climbing hills, so you need to take that into account. Additionally, in terms of armor, as I previously mentioned, you don't really have much. You have 45mm of frontal hull armor. It is angled, and you will get occasional bounces, but they're very uncommon. Additionally, you only have 70mm of turret armor, and even with the gun mantlet, you won't get bounces very often. The best way to use this tank, as I said, is to make yourself a small target. As you can see, the frontal profile of the vehicle isn't huge, and if you're just showing your turret, well, that's even less. Additionally, you have 10 degrees of gun depression, so you can kind of pop up on a ridge, fire, and then retreat without exposing very much of your tank. Additionally, the STA-2 doesn't have the high cupola that the STA-1 and Type 61 have, which means that peaking ridges is much easier for you because the enemy don't get that kind of free shot at the cupola as you're coming up. Additionally, the gun you have, the 90mm rifled gun, it's not a bad gun. Let me just grab up the stats for it. It's adequate. This gun is also present on the STA-1, but on the STA-2 it's actually slightly better. You have a faster aim time at 2.1 seconds, your accuracy is pretty much the same, and you shoot slightly faster at 8.45 rounds per minute. You have 185mm of penetration, which is adequate. It's better than a couple of the other Tier 8 mediums. I believe it's better than the Super Pershing, actually. And with 275mm of penetration on the heat rounds, well, if you can't penetrate the enemy from the front, you can always switch over to heat. But that's the whole point. You shouldn't be trying to engage the enemy from the front. You know, complaining that you can't penetrate an IS-3 or an IS-6 from the front is just ludicrous, because you're a medium tank. You're not supposed to be fighting them from the front. You're supposed to be getting around behind them and shooting them in the back. That's what you do. But the biggest weakness on the gun really is the .37 accuracy. And that's what really means that the tank kind of has to engage in that weird, not quite close range combat because it has no armor, but not quite long range combat because it doesn't really have the accuracy for it. On the upside as well, though, is it does have a lot of advantages over the STA-1 in terms of gun dispersion. The tank has much better dispersion values after firing and when you're moving the vehicle, which means on the move fire is a little bit more viable, and popping up ridges is much of a more sustainable tactic. And as I mentioned, you don't really have the turret armor, so getting hulled down behind ridges like a Pershing or a Super Pershing, it's a good idea, but you have to remember that you don't have the turret armor, so you can't just sit there and absorb shots on your turret. What you need to do is you take the shot, you pull back, move to a different location, pop up, take another shot, rinse and repeat. This can actually make the STA-2 quite an effective vehicle, and it can earn you quite an amount of damage. This is particularly relevant in that the STA-2 fills an important role in the Japanese tech tree, in that it is your high-tier tank trainer. So if we look at the Chi-No-Kai, the Chi-No-Kai is your Tier 5 medium tank trainer. And as you can see, it has a crew of 5. It has a loader, a radio man, a driver, a gunner, and a commander. Each is a separate role. This fulfills the Japanese tank pattern all the way up to Tier 7 with the Chiri, but once you get from the Chiri to the STA-1, you have a change. You lose the radio man. The radio man becomes your commander. So now you only have a crew of 4, and that's what the STA-2 exists for. It exists to train your tanks from Tier 8 through to Tier 10. And in that role, it is pretty good. You just have to remember kind of the strengths of the vehicle. And that is that weird kind of mid-range flanker niche that a lot of people can't really seem to quite appreciate. And it does require a lot of, I guess, learning by eye, really. Because with a 380 meter view range, 720 meter signal range, the tank generally has a pretty good idea of what's going on. You just need to be able to use that to your advantage. You need to kind of say, okay, I think the enemy are going to start pushing up here, I need to move back to a different location. You can't afford to kind of sit there and wait for them to get to you, because you won't really have the speed you need to get away, nor do you have the armor to kind of just sit there and wait and brawl it out. And I think possibly I play this tank too aggressively sometimes. I kind of really frontline with it and get it up there and get it in close. And sometimes that pays off for me. Other times I get horribly obliterated, especially against some of the Japanese heavy tanks with the howitzers nowadays. The big 152mm howitzers will go straight through this thing. But once you kind of get your eye in and you're able to find that niche for this tank, it becomes very, very effective because of that high rate of fire. I have a gun rammer on this thing. That gives me a roughly 6.3 second reload, which can really catch the enemy off guard with the amount of damage this tank is able to put out. Sure, it's only a 90mm gun, but if you're putting out 240 damage every 6 seconds, that's almost the same amount of damage that an IS-3 can put out with its 122mm guns that fire every 11 seconds. Granted, the IS-3 will have better penetration, but granted, you're a premium tank. You're not supposed to be as good as a non-premium vehicle. Additionally, I threw on a vertical stabilizer Mark 1. That'll help enhance the mobility of the vehicle. Other options you can choose, of course, are vents for the increased cruise skill, binocular telescope to increase the view range. I don't think the enhanced gun laying drive is worth on this tank. I think its aim time at 2.1 seconds is already favourable enough. Toolbox is one of those ones that I think could be useful. This tank does tend to suffer if it gets tracked, so being able to get your tracks up faster without needing to spend that repair kit is important, because that repair kit I often save in case I get my ammo rack knocked out, which does happen. This tank doesn't tend to explode very often, but the ammo rack can get hit because it is in the hull. But aside from that, everything else is pretty much redundant. You don't really need the camouflage net, you don't need the ammo rack, enhanced torsion bars, anything like that. The vehicle is generally pretty adequate as it is, but with a gun rammer and a stabilizer, the tank is pretty well equipped to do what it needs to do. So, as I said, STA-2, it's a tank that has, I think, an undeservedly bad reputation. It might not be the strongest vehicle out there, but it's a premium tank. It's not supposed to be, and once you kind of find its weird niche that it occupies, it's actually a very strong contender on the battlefield. And I think that it trains you quite well for the skills you need for the other Japanese tanks in the Type 61, the STB, etc. Granted, it doesn't quite play the same sniper role that they do, and in the changes in the upcoming patch, that might affect its gameplay a little bit, but I think that it's still a very strong tank and a good investment if you want to train up your Japanese tank crews. So let's go to the replays and see how we demonstrate that. So here we are on Abbey in the STA-2. And this is a very tier 9, very tier 10 sort of matchup. We're roughly down the bottom of the ladder with a couple of tank destroyers and light tanks below us. But this is the sort of game where in the STA-2 you don't really want to be playing very aggressively. You kind of want to be playing more of a passive role, which generally isn't how I play this tank. As I mentioned, I generally tend to play this tank quite aggressively, and probably more aggressively than I should. So in this game I'm going to try and be a little bit more passive. And I'm going to try and take it along this high road here on the western flank. Normally I would head up to that Abbey in sort of a tier 8 match, but because it's a tier 9, tier 10 game, there are a lot more tanks on both teams who generally will fill that role better than me. They'll have better guns, better turret armor, and generally speaking I'll be getting in the way there. So I figure I'll let the tanks better suited for that position do that, and instead I'll support this flank and try and secure kind of the possible attack routes for my allies and prevent them from getting outflanked. So unfortunately our M46 they're taking a hit from I think that was the T110E5, and nothing's really come over here yet, but generally speaking I know a lot of tank destroyers and light tanks like to make an approach up this way and try and get into those bushes to shoot across the Abbey. So this is actually a reasonably good position for us to hold, so long as we don't get outflanked by that low road. This is why we're turning around right now. We want to try and make sure that we're not getting snuck up on by anything. There's been more than a few occasions where I've gotten a little bit too focused on one road on this flank and accidentally found myself with far too many enemy tanks behind me. So again, this is not really ideal combat conditions for an STA-2. There aren't really great positions to flank here, so at the moment it's really trying to play that passive game more. Now an Oho's just arrived to back us up, so hopefully he'll be able to kind of help us frontline a little bit here, especially against some of those heavy tanks we saw lurking around, like that T110E5, and I believe there was a T10 there earlier. Ah, there we go. That Waffentrager 4. I knew a tank destroyer was going to show up over here at some point. I was just hoping it was going to be one that I could hurt, which thankfully the Waffentrager 4 is. So I'm going to back up a little bit. I don't want to go toe-to-toe with that, I believe that's a T10. So I'm going to try and back up a little bit more here, because I was worried that he was going to push around and potentially box me into that little divot I was in, which against a heavy tank like that, he can very easily push me around with a more powerful engine. So I don't really want to be kind of in a position where he can really dominate me with that frontal armor. So I'm going to poke out, take the track shot. That was actually going for his lower plate, but unfortunately I kind of stuffed the shot a little bit. Now our M46 has shown up to help us again, so he's tracked that IS. I'm going to take another shot at the lower plate, and unfortunately that didn't go through. So as you can see, the 189mm of penetration isn't really sufficient to go through the armor of kind of those higher tier heavy tanks, particularly at the front. And as I mentioned, the STA-2's job isn't really to engage enemies from the front, it's to engage them from the side, like with this Waffentrager. Now I don't have a very good shot on that Waffentrager, but I did have a shot on that T110E5. I'm surprised I didn't actually see him, but, you know, I'm not complaining, damage is damage. So, there we go, we've got that T10 again, and again, not something I really want to be engaging from the front. My AP rounds can't do much, but I'll try and go for some of those weak spots. Now I could load heat rounds here, but I feel that if I did load the heat, I would probably start getting a little bit too aggressive and start pushing up on a tank that I really shouldn't, particularly that he's got backup. Now that we've managed to outflank him though, I'm going to push up. Unfortunately, the AP round's not sufficient to go through the side of the turret, so I'm going to back off again and wait till my allies are in a good position for us to engage this T10. Generally speaking, it's best to fight 2v1 when you can. So I'm loading heat round now, and I've got the flat of his pike nose. As you can see, the heat round's absolutely making cheese out of this even angled frontal armor. But again, I try not to lean too heavily on the heat rounds, particularly in matchups like this, because I do find they kind of enable me to be a bit more aggressive, and often that causes my downfall. As you can see, my trademark aggressiveness is about to come out here. We've got a T110E5 down there, the one we shot earlier. He's on low health, and so I'm going to push around and try and get that kill, because if I can take him out, that's a very strong tier 10 that I can take out of the game. Unfortunately, that subjects me to some fire from that AMX, even though I do pick up the kill. So now it's me versus this AMX-30. Now, normally, this would not be a fair fight. The AMX-30 would probably beat me quite easily, because his DPM is better than mine, his alpha damage is better than mine, and while we can both penetrate each other quite easily, overall he'll have more health than me, so he can kind of trade better. However, he's on lower health than me at the moment, so I can really afford to kind of hide behind these holes here and try and poke out, give him as little of a target profile as possible, which is what you want to do, and let my allies do a little bit extra damage to him while I can pick him off while he's distracted. So as you can see, he's going to push around on me, and you can see I take a fair bit of damage from him on this next shot, but thankfully do manage to finish him off for my last kill of the game. So this time around we're on Sacred Valley in the STA-2, and again it's a pretty tier 9, tier 10 sort of matchup. So I've decided that I want to head up to the temple area on the western flank of this map, and I'll team up with some of the other medium tanks around here. As you can see, we've got some of the other pretty high tier medium tanks with us, the E50 and such, and as you can see, when it comes to hill climbing, they'll generally outpace you quite considerably. But that's okay, because the STA-2's role in combat isn't really to kind of have that high speed maneuverability. It's fast enough to get where it needs to be, but generally speaking, you don't need to have that speed in order to engage your enemies at kind of close quarters in a brawling context. So the enemy have already reached the temple ahead of us, and so we've got, I think that's a T-54 right there. So actually no, that's the Lorraine 40, so I'll put a shot into that Lorraine 40 and try and push around here to support our T-22. So put a shot into that T-54, unfortunately that one misses. So now I'm going to go after this Lorraine. The Lorraine is a bigger threat because of his auto-loader and the burst damage he can put out. So I'm going to focus on that engine deck, try and set him on fire. As you can see, the good rate of fire, not as good as an auto-loader, but I have set him on fire. And again, he's on fire, so I'll leave him. So I'm going to try and take a shot at this T-54, finish off the T-54, and someone else actually picks up the kill on that Lorraine. I think it's actually that E50 right there. Unfortunately, we couldn't quite save our friend in the T-22. but we've pretty much dominated this western flank here up at the temple. So now with the rest of the medium tanks, I'm going to push down into the lower valley area and show off kind of what the STA-2 can do quite well in terms of what I mentioned is that kind of positional sort of gameplay. Moving from different positions and trying to attack your enemies from different angles, which will negate, hopefully, their armor advantage. So I'm moving down to the low ground here. I didn't really want to get into that press of kind of more long-range tanks that were up there on the other roadway down to the enemy cap. So instead I'm going to push down across this low ground, trying to encircle some of those tank destroyers and medium tanks that might be lurking along the main road up to our north. Now I've got an angle on an object 430 over here, and this is a good demonstration of the gun on the STA-2. So I'll put one shot in, and I've got his rear, so hopefully I might be able to angle another one, and the gun's reloaded again, so I'll put another shot in, and again, these are some good shots, but the gun's not built for long-range combat, and you'll see in this next shot, which unfortunately goes low, and unfortunately I'm not able to pick up the kill there. That one actually damaged his tracks, so I'll have to leave that object 430 to someone else, and instead I'll push up here to try and help our allies that are pushing on the cap. So we've got a couple of medium tanks lurking over here. I believe one's a T-69, as well as, I think it's a Su-101. So I'm going to poke up on this T-69, put a shot in, pull back. I've realised he's not paying attention to me, so I'm going to put another shot into him and try and pull back so this Su-101 doesn't put a shot into me. So the T-69's not really paying attention, so I'm going to put some more pressure on him, put another shot into him, and try and farm as much damage as I can, hopefully finishing him off, although unfortunately one of our allies managed to pick up the kill there. So put a shot into that Su-101, again, pull back. We're in a good position to put some good damage in here on both of those medium tanks. So now I'm going to push down with this IS-3 to try and engage this Su-101. And as you can see, the maneuverability on the STA-2 is good, but the speed isn't great, so this sort of circling combat isn't really its forte. So the IS-3 is going to finish off that Su-101, and I'm going to push across the cap and try and take out the enemy artillery. Now, this is a sort of thing that the STA-2 shouldn't really be doing. Its on-the-move accuracy isn't amazing. I'll put a couple of shots in at this Su-14-1, but not any of them really connect, and if he hits me directly, he can potentially one-shot me because of how thin my armor is. So I'm going to try and kind of avoid any incoming fire if I can, although the splash does manage to take my tracks off and do a little bit of damage. But now that I'm stationary, I can put in the good damage, which is enough to finish him off. Even though it's only 4 damage, it's still a solid hit, and that's the sort of kind of strength of this gun, is it's very good when you're stationary, and the aim time means that you don't have to remain stationary long in order to get that shell on target. However, it doesn't really facilitate that kind of constantly mobile brawling combat that certain tanks, such as the Americans, in particular the M46, M48, as well as some of the German tanks like the Indian Panzer and the Leopard tanks, can kind of really pull off well. The STA-2, as I've mentioned, is more of that, as I said, positional combat, moving from point to point and trying to engage your enemies from the sides of the rear. Now the last 2 remaining tanks in the enemy team are, I believe, a Type 4 or Type 5 heavy. I can never remember which one's the Tier 10 for the Japanese. And the T110, I think it's an E3? Yeah, it's T110 E3. It's the one that doesn't have the turret. So I'm going to pull around here and again, following my own advice, try and get behind them. However, what am I going to do is, I'm going to wind up making a mistake here, and you'll see it. So I'm loading standard armor piercing because I'm getting behind them. I was going to load heat, but then I decided better of it because I'm shooting into the back of them. It's probably better off just to use regular armor piercing. So I'm going to come up here, I'm going to get a shot into the rear of this T110. Now, I always forget that the T110 can actually move. I always forget that it's not, say, actually no, it is an E4. My bad, it does have the turret. So I managed to put one into his engine deck, but I always forget these tanks can actually move. And unfortunately, we've lost a few tanks to these guys. They're really turtling up and doing quite well. And now, unfortunately, I should have probably pulled in there and attacked the side of that Type 5 instead of pushing around here, because now I'm frontlining against this T110 E4, which I don't want to be doing. As I said, you shouldn't really be trying to fight your gun against their frontal armor. So now I'm switching to heat rounds. I'm going to try and put a shot into his cupola. The heat rounds will penetrate, but again, this is not a strong position to be in, and I've kind of failed to follow my own advice in attacking the rear and the sides. So unfortunately I take an ammo rack hit there, but thankfully my allies are there to save my bacon in light of my own mistake. So for this one, we're on Runeberg in the STA-2, and this is a pretty good matchup for the STA-2. It's a very tier 8 sort of game, so we're going to head up to the village on the hill, and hopefully we can get into some good kind of medium range combat over this ridgeline and potentially get some longer range shots down that central radial alleyway into the main push that's happening in the town. So we've got the enemy light tanks and our allied light tanks scouting the ridge as usual. This T-37's deciding for a hard push over the hill, and that's probably going to be the death of him. As you can see, the mobile gunfire of the STA-2, not great, but we'll manage to finish him off with our last shot. So we're just going to pull up this hill a little bit towards kind of the cover of the buildings, just in case any enemy artillery or tanks down in the town were trying to take some shots at us after that T-37 had spotted us. So we're going to poke that ridge a little bit, and as you can see, we're now in a reasonably good position to try and shoot down this main laneway into the enemy heavy tanks that are pushing up the town, as we should be engaging their side plate. However, as you can see, the good accuracy on that shot is not really typical of the STA-2, and you'll see that a lot of the shots I have to take down this laneway at long distance don't really connect like I want them to, so I'm trying to put some shots into the back of that Canavan as well as the IS-6. And unfortunately they've kind of pulled back into cover there, and so I'm really kind of waiting for a small kind of piece of silhouette that I can really take a shot at. Unfortunately they're pretty well dug in, and I don't really want to be sitting here too long, because I think it'll be really a waste of the potential damage I can put out. So instead I'm going to try and push up the hill a little bit and support our push through the village. Again, the tank doesn't really excel at long range, it's more for that mid-range style of combat. However, we have got a KV-4 pushing up that centre road, and that was the M56 Scorpion, but this is a really good position for the STA-2 in regards to that KV-4, because he's giving us his back, and this is really the sort of fighting you want to be doing, shooting your opponents in the back, in the sides, and doing as much damage as possible, because we don't need our premium rounds to penetrate him from these angles. However, we are a little bit out of our optimal range, and so some of our rounds are going a little bit low, and now that he's managed to bring his frontal armor around to us, unfortunately we can't penetrate him from this angle, so we would need to switch to heat rounds for that. But for now we're just going to pull back a little bit and perhaps try and put some pressure on that M56 Scorpion. The M56 could be quite a dangerous tank. Up close it's a little bit weak due to its light armor, however it's quite stealthy. The 90mm gun it has is quite good, and its small target profile makes it quite hard to hit, particularly if it gets that gun hull down. So I'm going to put a couple of shots into that Scorpion, back off, just so I avoid the return fire from the enemies down the laneway and also from that Scorpion, and our enemies will finish him off. Now trying to get an angle on that Canavan again, but once again not really doing much, and that KV-4 is pretty well dug into a little alcove now. So instead I'm going to push over, switch positions, and try and find another position from which to attack the enemy. We've pretty much cleared this flank with the death of that Scorpion, although there might be a couple of little light tanks lurking around, and indeed they will show up later. We're doing pretty well. We've managed to dominate this flank pretty strongly, and our allies in the city are doing pretty well, but at this point in time it could still be anyone's game. So we're going to push around through the rear point of the enemy team from their cap area. Now we could push straight for the cap, but that would generally just pull the enemy's attention towards us again. We want to be attacking from the rear, so we're going to shoot this OI in the back and finish him off. Now we could have penetrated that OI from the front just as easily. The thing about Japanese heavy tanks is that their front armor is the same as their rear armor. However, if we're engaging him from the front, that means his attention's to us, he can see us, and it's much easier for him to bring his gun onto us. Again, attacking from the rear is the safest option in the STA-2, because your light armor means that you can't really be affording to take those hits. Again, it is kind of a flanking medium tank. So we're going to push up with the Super Pershing and engage the IS-3. Now we've got his rear plate, again, exactly where we want to be. So we put one shot into him, pull back a little bit, try and get another shot into him. Unfortunately, that one doesn't quite go into the lower plate, and the Super Pershing decides to go toe-to-toe with the IS-3, which unfortunately means he's blocking off our shot at his lower plate. And again, the penetration on this gun not quite enough to go through the lower plate of that IS-3. Now the IS-3 is doing the right thing here. He's angling himself side onto me, and that means my heat rounds won't be able to go through his spaced armor on his side, and the angle's too strong for my normal AP rounds. So at the moment I'm just trying to focus on blowing his tracks off and keeping him immobilized for our allies to come up and actually help me. Now I'm angling for a shot on his cupoles. Unfortunately that one misses, and he did shoot my track off. So now I'm just going to try and keep him immobilized, try and stick back here in cover, and again wait for my allies to show up, but no one's really kind of making a push for it. So instead I'm going to switch around to heat rounds, and this time around I know he's fired, so I'll put a heat round into his cupola and finish him off. Now, all that's left on the enemy team is a couple of light tanks and some artillery, so I'm going to go hunting for those light tanks. Now I know the Walker Bulldog is over here somewhere, because I saw him up in the town earlier, and there's the Bulldog. So I'll put one shot in, and I think that actually broke his ammo rack, and before I get the other shot loaded up, someone else finishes him off. So now all that's left is the Speerpanzer, and I know where he is. He's up in the village up here, so I'm going to come and hunt him down. Now, the Speerpanzer can be a bit of a tricky opponent if he has that 90mm auto-loading gun. However, I'm pretty confident that I should be able to take him down relatively quickly, and because of my heavier weight and higher armor, I should be able to ram him if I need to and try and kind of realign our health pools. So he'll put the first shot in because he knew I was coming, he could see me. But I'll put one shot into him and he's on low health, so I should be able to finish him off with the second one, bumping him to stop him from getting around me, and finishing him off with my last shot for 5 kills this game.